So, chapter 1, my notes of Pete Walker's from CPTSD from thriving to surviving. So these are the notes that I've been making as I've been reading through the chapter. CPTSD is a learned set of responses and a failure to complete numerous important developmental tasks. It's caused by environment. It's not genetic. So it's caused by a lack of nurture. And it's possible to heal some of these. He talks about reparenting by committee, creating those relational aspects with others over time instead of expecting our parents to magically change and heal. We get to do this work with other people, and it doesn't need to be with people. If people feels too challenging, it can be done with pets and books and online therapeutic websites. And I know that that's something that resonates for me. A lot of my early work in this sort of stuff has been dipping into the work slowly and carefully with choice and retreating where necessary to recover. This book is aimed at abusive or neglectful family start in life, which is the most common form of CPTSD. Traumatizing abuse and abandonment can occur on verbal, emotional, spiritual, and or physical levels. Then we move into a definition of complex PTSD. The most common and troublesome features are emotional flashbacks, toxic shame, self-abandonment, a vicious inner critic, social anxiety. I don't know about you, but when I read this, my first response was, what the fuck, you mean not everyone experiences this? And there was a lot of stuff moving in my system. So, taking a breath. So, the book then goes on to describing in more detail these sections. If at any point, like me, you notice yourself going into freeze or dissociating, checking out while you're listening, panicking, or anything that is taking you out of a good space, remember you're in choice about listening to this and watching this. You can take a pause, process what's coming up for you. You can do this by shaking, by actually like getting up and doing a big shake, making noises, sounding or shouting into a pillow if you want to make bigger noises. Journaling can be another way to release what's coming up for you, and do it in bite-sized chunks. Make a note of the time that you've had to pause and come back to it later. Or if it's a bit that you don't feel like you're ready for at all right now, just skip over it, come back to it another time. So, moving on to emotional flashbacks. I just realised I've written a story about emotional flashbacks, so I think I'm going to share it. I share it with you on my YouTube. So these are sudden and often prolonged regressions to overwhelming feeling states, such as overwhelming fear, shame, alienation, rage, grief, and depression. And an unnecessary triggering of fight or flight responses. These flashbacks can be sudden, they can be subtle, they can be horrific, or anything in between. The book then goes into an example of an emotional flashback where he describes how the trigger activated a somatic response in him that took 10 years to understand the roots of. He later understood it was a flashback to the hundreds of times his mother blasted him with her rage, provoking feelings of terror, shame, dissociation, and helplessness. And I think this is where this alters from the story that I brought to mind, in that when we have visuals, then it's usually like there's one particular memory of this. When it's ongoing things, we don't tend to have one memory that we can tune into one memory of it. So without this one point, then there's often not a visual component, unlike regular PTSD, single PTSD. So these flashbacks come with the fight or flight response and activation of the nervous system. You can create fear, which shows up as anxiety, panic, and can be suicidal. Despair can show up as numbness, paralysis, and a desperation to hide. There's commonly a sense of feeling small, young, helpless, fragile, and typically overlaid with toxic shame. Taking a breath with that. So, toxic shame. It destroys self-esteem. A flashback to feeling the contempt of the parent. And it can also be created by constant rejection and neglect. I'm noticing in myself a desire to skip over this bit completely, feeling like it doesn't affect me. Yet I know it's there. I'm feeling that this is a part of my ADHD wiring, to just kind of move through it very quickly to get past it. And I think for me it lies in that absence of attention. My parents not giving me the attention that I needed, and I get avoidant behaviour, which is what's coming up when I'm trying to read this section. So the notes that I made on this were regression to worthlessness and alienation. It stops us from seeking comfort and support. We isolate ourselves. And then my response in this is, fuck you all, I'm leaving. I don't want to engage with any of you. That's how it comes up for me. Then there's a list of common CPTSD symptoms which depend on your patterns of behaviour and your abuse neglect pattern. I didn't write this down, but I'm noticing a desire to read it out for you now, so I'm just going to go and find it. Nearly there. Here we go. So, emotional flashbacks, tyrannical inner and or outer critic, toxic shame, self-abandonment, societal anxiety, abject feelings of loneliness and abandonment, fragile self-esteem, attachment disorder, developmental arrests, relationship difficulties, radical mood vacillations such as pseudocyclothymia, which is in chapter 12, dissociation via distracting activities or mental processes, hair-triggered fight or flight response, oversensitivity to stressful situations, and suicidal ideation. So, active suicidality, where someone's actively making steps towards taking their life, requires a level of support outside of this space. And I'll put some links into the thread if anyone needs support with that. The book talks about passive suicidality being far more common with CPTSD, and it can be an ongoing fantasy or one that ends abruptly. The key differences here being its thought process, not an actual serious commitment. It's often a flashback to childhood abandonment and can be a sign of a particularly intense flashback. So it feels like just knowing that's what's going on might be enough. I know for me, when I've had that, then it's just been like a switch has flipped and suddenly everything's okay again. So CPTSD can be misdiagnosed as many things, which the book goes on to list. It talks about reducing CPTSD to a panic disorder is like calling food allergies chronically itchy eyes. Though I kind of say maybe that should be IBS. Treating the diagnoses as character defects rather than maladaptions to stress means they're masked with medication, but the underlying symptoms remain. If we instead look at these maladaptions, we can reduce them and replace them with more functional adaptations to stress. I've written an example of my own experience here with I have ARFID, which is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, and I notice that flares up when I've got other stress going on in my life. So instead of me trying to fix it then and trying to do better with food then, which will add extra layers of stress to my life on top of whatever stress is I'm already getting, then I'll look at ways to reduce the stress in other areas of my life and know that my ARFID flare-up will come to rest, and if it doesn't, to pay attention to it and to come back to it once I feel that everything's under a little bit more control. I don't know if that's helpful to anyone, but I felt important to make a note of it. So then it goes into the origins of CPTSD. This is often associated with extended periods of physical or sexual abuse. It also can be triggered by verbal and emotional abuse. Contempt towards the child develops into fear and shame within the child, stopping the child from crying out or asking for attention. Abusive parents add corporal punishment to this mix. It can be caused simply by an emotional neglect alone. So if you're noticing your trauma feels insignificant compared to others, check out chapter 5 and come back. Parents who ignore child's calls for attention abandon their child to fear. Then there's a section talking about the 4 F's. The 4 F's that the book goes into is fight, which is narcissistic, flight, which shows up as obsessive compulsive, freeze, which is dissociative, and fawn, which is codependent. So the book gives a story that shows examples of each of these defences. I've gone over this again. So fight, responding aggressively to something. Flight, responding, this is something that stirred up a big thing in me. Flight is responding by fleeing, or symbolically fleeing by launching into hyperactivity. And that's where the obsessive compulsive side comes in, by feeling that you must get things done, must be occupied. Then freeze shows up as giving up, numbing out into dissociation, or even into collapse, which I understand as being the fifth F state, which is flop. Fawn, responding to a threat by trying to be pleasing or helpful in order to appease the attacker. And in that final section of this chapter, the thing that really stood out for me was a phrase, repetition, compulsion, reenactment, or reenactment, that trauma survivors are particularly susceptible to it, and that we'll be going over in returning to in the book many times. And I think that's a way that it's been described as like attracting trauma, and also heard of people saying these things keep on showing up for you until you're ready to face them and change that story. So it's great that I'm going to find tools to change those stories. 17 minutes, I think that's a good enough length of time. I haven't spoken about everything in chapter 1, but hopefully that's enough of a summary for you to catch up and understand what we're talking about in the meeting.